If you are not pushing the envelope and breaking things that you're doing today, you're not doing this right. You might be making some improvements, but you're not making those fundamental choices that will foundationally enable AI and autonomy to thrive. I'm Aranda, and this is Supply Change. Here, we go beyond AI hype to examine how to stand up intelligent supply chains in complex organizations. If you want a clear-eyed view of how to do this in the real world, this show is for you. As we record today's episode, we're 6 weeks into the Iran conflict. And frankly, if you look over the past 12 months or so, they've in many ways been tailor-made to demonstrate the promise of AI in supply chain. If we look at the impacts of the closing of the Hormuz Strait, you see where having visibility to the impacts onto supply chains, starting from the material impacts. So what does this mean in terms of oil and energy, in terms of petrochemical products? How does this impact various industries from chip making in terms of helium and tungsten availability to agriculture in terms of fertilizer availability? So what are those raw materials that we rely on coming out of the Middle East that are now impacted by the closure of the strait? How then does that ripple through your organization's supply chain? What are the products that are affected? What production is affected in your plants, in your operations? What impacts does that have to your customers? The question is, how do I have visibility to, what really are those impacts that I need to look at? What is important for me to think about? What is important for me to react to? What is important for me to respond to? It's within that we see the promise of AI to help try to bring visibility to what's actually going on, not only inside of my supply chain, but upstream of my supply chain. But as we looked at last week, thinking about the pyramid, starting with automation, then analytics, moving up to cognition, and finally autonomy, we also saw how complicated it is to try to bring that to life. This is the challenge that leaders face today. And as we talk about this, I want us to frame this in sort of two very big dimensions. And it really points to the depth and breadth with which leaders need to think about how they're going to approach AI, and more broadly, how they're going to approach autonomy. And really, it's going to be about making two very fundamental strategic choices. One is around how existential an opportunity do you believe AI and autonomy provides for your operations? That's question number one. Question number two is going to be around, how do you see this being realized? Is this a replacement model for your people, or is this an augment model for your people? Both of those are really fundamental choices that leaders are going to have to think through and decide for themselves. There's no path, there's no answer, there is no off-the-shelf book that you can pick up and say, here is the playbook that I'm going to follow for my organization. You're going to have to think along those two axes, because they're going to really inform and animate the choices that you need to make as you go down this journey of autonomy, or perhaps not. What are the raw materials that I need to think about? What are the transportation lanes that I need to worry about? What are the customs impacts of tariffs A, B, or C? Which customers do those products affect? Who are the important customers that I need to think about? Even if you have AI, even with the promise of autonomy, getting to the state where your organization has visibility to all those materials, all those impacts, and now is able to make choices around that information, requires a root to branch rethink and re-architecting of how most organizations are structured today. That is why we need a new kind of leadership in order to take the organizations from where they are to where they need to be, regardless of where you end up on those two axes of choices in terms of really how existential do you think AI is to you as an organization, because there's still a digitalization journey that you have to think about, or whether or not you choose replacement or augmentation. And of course, over the course of the season of this podcast, we'll talk about where do we think those choices should land and what might actually make sense for your organization. That is very much the heart of what I would love to explore. I have hypotheses. I have some thoughts on this, but let's see where the data, where the guests, where the conversations take us in terms of what might make sense for your organization. When I say AI and the journey to autonomy needs a new kind of leader, I think back to an article that I read recently on LinkedIn that I think encapsulates the challenge that a lot of organizations are going to face. The article is really talking about lean. And I think lean really is a fantastic analog to the journey a lot of organizations are going to need to take in order to bring AI and autonomy to life. So maybe let's step back real quickly. What is lean? Lean really is a management philosophy that is anchored around trying to drive as much waste out of your processes in order to be able to satisfy customer needs as quickly and efficiently as possible. Now, there's a lot more behind lean, and I'm sure there are going to be some lean practitioners that say I have oversimplified that. But that at its core is what lean is about. It's about taking waste out of the system so that you can serve your customer as efficiently and cost effectively as possible. Lean really was pioneered by Toyota and has been taken on by a lot of other organizations. It's been around for 70, 80 years as a philosophy. And a lot of businesses have gone down the road of wanting to bring lean into their operations, whether it's their manufacturing or logistics, or even into their way of really thinking strategically. But what I have certainly observed over and over again is that a lot of people start lean. Very few people sustain lean. I'm not going to say finish lean, because part of the philosophy of lean is that you never finish, because you're continuously improving. You're always looking for how you can get better day in, day out. So it's really about sustaining, not completing lean. And that's where a lot of organizations and leaders flounder, because a lot of our incentives, a lot of our cultures, a lot of our governance structures are geared to really try and think about lean as a project with a start, middle, and end. We struggle with that being a continuous process, ongoing as a journey. Coming back to this article on LinkedIn, it was talking about AI as a way to short circuit that cultural journey, that management philosophy evolution that lean really embodies. And I think that's the danger that we have with AI that I see. It's that we come back to thinking that AI is this magic genie in a lamp that if we rub it and prompt it the right way, it allows us to short circuit process. It allows us to short circuit a proper rethink and re-architecting of organizations. The crux of that article was that if you implement AI will solve all the underlying problems for you. And I think that mindset is a dangerous one for a lot of organizations, because we think that there is a beginning, middle, and end. We can pilot, we can implement, and now we reap all the value that comes from AI and autonomy. But as we talked about in episode 1, it really is a pyramid where you build on the foundations that come before and progressively move towards autonomy. Remember that on the journey to autonomy, the nirvana is that the machine can ingest information, can process it, can decide, and can act. It can do that with little or no human intervention, or even in the bounded autonomy perspective, as little human intervention as possible. This is going to require architecting a whole new way of working. And that architecting is not an IT or technology implementation challenge. That is fundamentally a strategic choice that the organization needs to make. This conversation has to be elevated out of the project mindset, the vendor, the IT organization, the project leader, and elevated into the C-suite, the board of directors, to really rethink how does our organization need to be redesigned and architected in order to maximize value from AI and autonomy. Again, on the premise that you've made the choice that says that is the direction that I want to go in. Because that's the key. How you do business has to change fundamentally in order for you to realize the complete value from AI and autonomy. This is not a bolt-on solution. As we think about this when it comes to AI, there are four things that we need to consider. AI specifically, one, recall that it's probabilistic, not deterministic. And that means you really have to wrap it with the tech stack and the context that it requires in order to actually be able to process information correctly without hallucinating, but still where it is able to make judgment calls, the types of judgment calls that you want to hand off to the AI. Two, AI does not stand alone. It stands within that tech stack. So what's the wrapper that you have to put around that? How are you architecting your data, thinking about your data flows, your information and decision flows? This introduces a whole new set of risks. So how are you thinking about managing those risks? What are the risks that you're willing to hand off to the AI? What are those risks that have to stay with the human? Are you thinking about the breadth of risks around security, around data integrity, around, resistance to digital attacks into your organization that this may now enable? As you move up the pyramid of autonomy, you start removing some flexibility. As you're handing this off now to the machine, remember, you no longer have Mike there to make decisions, to make judgment calls. That is now with the machine. So how do you strike the balance in terms of what flexibilities am I enabling the AI to make? Coming back to that risk conversation. And lastly, this is about orchestration. These decisions, the AI does not exist only within supply chain. It exists within the enterprise. So how is it talking to sales, to finance? How is it talking to legal? You don't exist in a vacuum. How are your systems and processes now interacting with your suppliers, with your customers, with your partners? How is that happening on an integrated basis? Leaders will have to rethink their organizations across all these elements. And that's going to take a very different kind of leader that's on a journey, that's playing a long game, that some people talk about as the infinite game. How do you play that game? That's a different leader than one that is in a beginning, middle, and end, because we don't know where that end is. One of the things that I constantly hear in conversations around implementing AI is it's a top-down mandate, right? People are being told, well, we go do AI, go implement AI, figure it out. And in as much as I've talked about this really needs to be a top-down directive, because the organization needs to have a degree of commitment if you're going to go down this path, right? Are you enabling the investment resources? Are you enabling the time for people to be able to work on what that architecting of the new organization looks like? Is this enabling the space for people to make mistakes, for people to get it wrong, to experiment, to try things? In as much as that top-down sort of clearance, that mandate to behave has to be there, it is not a top-down directive that's going to get you to autonomy, that's going to get you to successful deployment of AI. It requires a marriage of that top-down with bottoms-up. This is where I go back to where lean is a really great analogy and part of where the breakdown happens. Because lean is also very much about empowering and pushing decision-making as close to where that decision impact is felt as possible. So that's pushing it to the person on the production line. That's pushing it to the person that's scheduling a vehicle. That's pushing it to your trade compliance team that is managing your tariff exposure. That is pushing it to your production scheduler that's deciding what needs to run on what lines. That's pushing it to your inventory planner that's deciding, well, how much inventory of product A should I have versus product B? As leaders in the C-suite, you will not have visibility to those. The leadership behavior now that needs to happen is how do you empower that organization to be able to make those choices, make those decisions, make those process improvements in ways that get you down that journey of AI implementation and autonomy that you're pursuing. Again, it's going to be critical then that leaders really get out of the conference room and are actively involved with their teams to be able to understand and help shepherd the organization through those choices that you need to make. Because make no mistake about this, if you are not making tough choices, if you are not pushing the envelope and breaking things that you're doing today, you're not doing this right. You are not re-architecting. You might be smoothing over. You might be making some improvements, but you're not making those fundamental choices that will foundationally enable AI and autonomy to thrive. I'll give you a simple example. I remember many times sitting in those conference rooms, patting ourselves on the back about a new tool or a new process that we've implemented that moves us down the digitalization path, right? It might be a new inventory planning software, or it may be a new visibility tool that we've implemented. And we can confidently in that room check a box that say, yes, we're now digital. But when you leave that room and you go talk to the people that are executing tasks on a day-to-day basis, you start seeing that digital tool that I thought just happened automatically requires somebody to copy and paste from system A into a spreadsheet, clean up some data, and then plug it into system B. And now system B can run. So it just becomes a glorified front end. The processing, the decision-making, what's happening behind that report that I see on my screen is still very manual. Even though I thought that system that I paid hundreds of thousands or in some cases millions of dollars to implement, I thought it was doing it, we still have 3, 4, 5, X number of people feeding it the data that I thought it was getting automatically. So when you're in that boardroom, you hear we're automated, you hear we're digital, we have implemented AI, box checked. When you get to the front line, data cleansing, manual interventions. And worse, you get, I just ignore it. That inventory level that it said, I don't obey it. It said 1,000, it's wrong, 500. So even though we think we've achieved autonomy, we've achieved AI, we're actually just on the front end. Because we still have a whole process redesign, a whole process architecture that still has to happen. And that's where as leaders, we really have to be mindful of pressure testing, of sanity checking, of getting in there and saying, show me, don't just tell me. And this is where those incentives can become really problematic. Because guess what? In that boardroom, we checked the box. We got bonused. We got promoted. On the front lines, they're still struggling. So where do we learn as leaders to get out of the conference room and go see? 2, when they tell me, well, I ignore the 1,500 and I just put in 500 because the system is wrong. How do we not let that sit? Well, why do you think it's 500? Why not 1,500? It's not just telling, well, just put 1,500 in. It's about engaging and then thinking about, now, how do I capture the knowledge, the experience, the expertise that that person has that says 500 instead of 1,500. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but it's that engagement then in terms of, okay, now how do we take what's going on inside of their head and either we systematize that or we redesign the process in order to, perhaps the answer is 500. So now how do we fix the machine to get 500 instead of 1,500? Or maybe it's 750. But that's really about now getting in, understanding and working with the process in order to get it right. That's where people fail on lean because we don't want to spend the time to get it right. Actually, no, I'll change that. We don't want to spend the time to get it wrong because it's getting it wrong that allows us to get it right. We thought 1,500, we were wrong. Now let's adjust. Let's correct it. Let's bring in the experts. Let's bring in the knowledge. Let's bring in the other factors that impacted it to make it 500 instead of just throwing out the system and saying, well, you know what? It's wrong. We're not going to use that tool any longer. And that oftentimes then is what happens. So we've patted ourselves in the back in the boardroom. We've gotten bonused. We've gotten our promotions. And you come back a year later or 2 years later, and that system that we were so proud of, that system that we championed, has fallen off to the wayside. That's going to be the danger with AI. That's going to be the danger with autonomy. That's why that commitment on the front end as leaders is critical. That commitment to sustain the choices that the organization has to make in order to be able to embed and get autonomy where it needs to be. And that's why I think we're starting to see a steady drumbeat of pilots that fail. We piloted it, we tried it, it didn't work, we're done. So AI is not the answer. Agentic AI, Gen AI, digital, that inventory recommendation tool, advanced planning, it doesn't solve the problem. What I find at the core of those is not that the tool failed. It's that leaders did not create the context within which that tool could succeed. That's the leadership that we need going forward, whatever the strategic choice you make is. Because you're making that with uncertainty. You're making that with an organization where you have to change your people, not in terms of whether they have jobs or not, but in terms of the capabilities they have, in terms of the incentives under which they operate. You have to change your processes. What worked yesterday when Mike was in the loop, making the decision, driving that judgment call, is not what works when that's a machine learning system, is not what works when that's a machine learning algorithm, is not what works when that is a Gen AI chatbot. You have to think about what is that technology stack that you're going to implement. Where do I put RPA in? Where do I put a chatbot in? Where do I put Gen AI as a knowledge base? Where do I have agentic? There are a tremendous amount of unknowns that we just cannot yet anticipate with AI. There are a lot of folks that don't think AI is an answer, that are skeptical of AI as a tool because it hallucinates, because of the security risks, because of the danger that it poses in terms of people thinking that AI is thinking. And they'll argue that it's just a word generation engine. There are a lot of people that don't think you want to bring probabilistic tools into a lot of supply chain activities. So yes, there are a lot of unknowns. There are a lot of risks that we have to think about. That's the reality. There's also a tremendous amount of opportunity that is yet to be explored. In this space where there's a lot of uncertainty, and we really don't yet know where organizations need to go. We really don't yet have a roadmap for you to follow. The leadership that we need to have is one that can not only survive that uncertainty, but one that can thrive in that uncertainty. One that can inspire and harness the innovation, creativity, knowledge, expertise of the teams that you have today and transition them into one that is leading the organization into the autonomous, AI-embedded future of tomorrow. Whether that is 10% AI, 50% AI, 100% AI, on whatever that spectrum that you're measuring your AI implementation journey on. Regardless of where you end up on AI in your organization in terms of how impactful it ends up being as part of your organizational design, where we are today offers a tremendous opportunity for leaders to rethink where value is created in their operations, where value is created for their customers. Even if you are skeptical of what AI can bring in, I encourage you to take this time to really step back and think about where you sit in that value chain. What are your customers demanding of you? What are your competitors doing? If nothing else, that's a useful exercise for you to sanity check whether or not you are maximizing your operations. I certainly would argue that every organization has a lot of room for improvement. Nobody is perfect. That exercise, even if it's just in the context of lean as a continuous improvement activity in terms of thinking about where can you progressively remove the wastes that are inherent in every operation. That's a valuable exercise for you to undertake. And I encourage you to do that with curiosity, with an open mind. Don't prejudge whether AI is or is not the answer or even an answer. As we go through the season, we'll talk a lot more about that replacement versus augmentation model for AI. I certainly have a strong bias to the augment versus replace. But wherever you land on that spectrum, you will still have to work through the technical implementation of AI, that maturation from automate to analyze to cognition to autonomy. For leaders, successful AI deployment is going to require you to step out of the conference room, roll up your sleeves, and really work top to bottom throughout your entire organization to help your team leads, your division heads, your project leads, your frontline workers to think through and understand the strategic direction that the organization needs to take, anchored in that choice, those choices that we talked about at the very beginning of this episode, and enable them and help them make the decisions about how then are we redesigning the processes that we need? How then are we investing in the systems and capabilities that are required in order to execute those processes? And believe me, there are a ton of processes and activities that your organization is going to have to look at and confront over and over and over again as you continuously improve and refine. You will not get this right on implementation day 0. You will not get this right on implementation day 100, 1000. I'll give you a simple example. We've had GPS systems for many years now. But I'll tell you, there are often times where GPS will tell me, take Westwood, turn left onto Wirt, and take that down to Memorial for me to get to my destination. And I can't tell you how many times I override GPS. Even though I know the reason I rely on GPS is because it's supposed to know what traffic is out there, whether there are road closures, and it's supposed to be able to guide me knowing all that information to what the optimal route is. But I still override it. I override it because I'm human. There are things that I believe I know, things that I believe I understand, that the AI or the GPS system, you know what, it's not taking that into account. It doesn't know that it's 8 a.m. and guess what? There's a school zone that I don't want to hit. That right turn is always problematic and I don't want to have to deal with that. So guess what? I ignore what I value, which is it's supposed to know traffic, it's supposed to know road closure. I say, you know, I am going to go a route where I don't have visibility to any of those things. We do this over and over and over again in so many dimensions of our lives. That's why you have to get out of the boardroom. That's why you have to get out of the conference room. How are you changing the incentives for the organization for them not to ignore what the tool is giving you, but as you're rolling this out in your organization, where and how are you empowering the teams that are designing the new processes, that are designing the new capabilities into your ways of working? How are you giving them that access? How are you enabling that granular understanding of why are we going down Wirt instead of Bingle? And then adjusting if you need more information. How are you building that trust, that credibility of the tool so that I don't ignore the direction to go down Wirt and just go down Bingle? Either we improve the system so that it knows not to go down Wirt and go down Bingle, or we change the way I'm thinking. I no longer override the tool. I no longer override the system. I now trust it to go down Wirt. Because guess what? If it is 8 a.m. and there's a school zone, it knows to put me to Bingle. If that right turn that I always knew existed is problematic, it knows to put me down Bingle. And now I have a lot more trust in the system. That's rolling up your sleeves. That's getting out there and changing the behavioral incentives and choices that your organization is taking around the way they're approaching AI. We'll get a lot more into that in the next episode when we talk about culture and change management. But as leaders, it's really imperative that you have that mindset that says, I am shepherding my organization through a journey. I am not implementing a project. That's a significant leadership mind shift. You're going to have to be much more attuned to what can AI in fact do. Where are my pockets of value for which AI is the right answer? And then how do I thrive through that uncertainty? How do I help the organization work through the inevitable failure? We plan, we do, we check, we adjust. That's the leadership mindset we have. So I'll leave you with that last lean analogy. As you go back and think about those two strategic choices, is AI an existential value creator that I need to lean into and commit? And if so, how do I best realize that value? Is it replace or augment? There is a lot to think about, a lot to unpack. Join me on the next episode of Supply Change as we continue this conversation. Thanks for listening to Supply Change. If today's conversation sparked questions, and it should, that's the point. Supply chain is complex, and these questions don't resolve in a single conversation. Share this podcast with someone who's navigating these decisions, and join us for the next episode as we continue exploring what it really takes to make AI work.